Well, it is once again Wainrider Wednesday, and so far the factions we have looked at have all existed canonically in the lore, in that you've been able to find references to them that pretty clearly insinuate that yes, there was a Gondor, yes, there was a Western or Rovanian Wainrider group, even if they weren't called the Western Horde, this group of Wainriders did exist, so on for the tribes of the Harad and Angmar. But today I thought it might be fun to look at another end of the map, and a faction that, while it is never named in the lore, we can infer may have existed in some capacity. That, of course, would be the Avari. Now, the Avari is the collective name for the elves who refused the westward journey, the call of the Valar, way back, and, even before the ages were really counted, I believe. So going very, very far back into the mists of time, indeed. Now, as for whether there was ever an Avari faction or kingdom of the Avari, we have zero evidence of that. But there must have been some elves living in Middle-earth who were not affiliated with any of the kingdoms that we do know about. Of course, there were elves in Thranduil's realm at this time. There were elves living in Lorien, living in Rivendell, living in Lindon. Those are the ones that we know about. There is also, I believe, some suggestion, some evidence for elves living around at Helond in the coasts of Gondor, near what would be known as Dol Amroth. But apart from that, we know basically nothing. So the inclusion of an elven faction called the Avari in the Third Age of Middle-earth, when none is referred to, may be seen as somewhat of a controversial choice. But there's something I think rather fitting in where and how we've chosen to implement this particular faction. Based on what little we know of the terrain, the geography, the foliage even of Eastern Middle-earth, there is at least an indication from Tolkien himself that the area to the northeast of the Sea of Rhûn, this area here, was actually somewhat thickly forested. This would seem to make this location a prime area for elves who made it their business to keep away from the prying eyes, maybe of men, of other elves, of other peoples. And furthermore, the area is not very far from another controversial region known as Dorwinion. Of course, that can be found over here on the northwestern area of the Sea of Rhûn, and the most we know about this place is that there was apparently traffic of some kind between it and the woodland realm far up the Celduin. This has led some people to suppose that perhaps Dorwinion was an elf kingdom. Now, if you're familiar with 4th Age Total War, you will know that that is definitely not the direction that the faction went in that mod. Dorwinion there is a mannish realm viewed as the last vestige of Gondorian expansion, earlier in the Third Age, a sort of broken off splinter state, if you will, that managed somehow to survive even into the 4th Age. But Wainriders, of course, gives us a different period of history and a different opportunity to see and imagine what might have happened in this part of the world. I see then our placement of the Avari on the eastern shores and areas of the Sea of Rhûn as potentially leaving the door open for you to interpret Dorwinion how you will. Initially, the region of Dorwinion is held by rebels. You could imagine these rebels to have been influenced perhaps by Gondor in the distant past, and perhaps they would go on in the 4th Age to form the mannish kingdom of Dorwinion that you know there. On the other hand, if you're partial to an elven Dorwinion, well then, if you play the Avari, you can make it yourself by conquering this territory and setting up trade routes along the river. And that may be a pretty worthwhile strategy, actually. You see, initially, there's not too much going on in this corner of the map. Of course, to your south, you will have the Wainrider faction of Great Rhûn, and in fact, you do share a border with them right here along your southeastern border. Northward and eastward are the Highland tribes, a faction we'll be looking at in a little bit. North and west along the river is the League of the North, another faction, sort of a mannish dwarven mix, which we will be looking at shortly. And more immediately to your west, the Wainriders of Rovanion, the Western Horde. But although you are surrounded, theoretically by 4 factions, those factions are either small, probably concerned with other wars at least initially, or surrounded by enough rebels that they're not likely to make you a target in the first few turns. As the Avari, then, you may adopt a strategy of trying to fly under the radar for a little while, grabbing a rebel settlement here or there, just trying to build up your power base before you can expand. But as a faction that we know nothing about, although we know that Avari elves must have lived somewhere in Middle-earth, we imagine that the Avari campaign is going to be one of the more difficult ones. So while you will be able to do some early expansion, perhaps relatively easily, growing strong after that point is going to be another matter. Now, how we're imagining elven recruitment at this stage in the mod is that, generally speaking, they will have lower population growth than Mannish factions, and they will also generally be restricted in terms of where they can train their units. You won't be able to train elves just anywhere on the map. Of the 3 elven factions that will appear in Wainriders, we're imagining that the Avari are going to be the fastest growers. They, of course, are not lured by the call of the sea. They're not susceptible to the longing for the west that the Noldor or the Sindar are. And so they will probably be more able to grow their own people. But where you can grow that population is going to be limited largely to your starting settlements and some select nearby places. So we can take a closer look at these, as this is actually the first look at some elven settlements in the mod. So this one right here is probably the one we can get the best look at, being outside the forest and all. And again, we've got a resource right outside here that we're going to be moving some of these items around. So of course, we'll do the usual thing and mention that this is a work in progress and visuals are subject to change. And in fact, Valor cannot stop himself from tinkering endlessly with the mod. So we expect there may be some changes to come as the days go on. But here we've got sort of an elven settlement that I believe this model will be shared by all 3 of the elven factions. So it's quite a feat to come up with a settlement that could work for all 3 groups of elves. We've got the Avari here, of course, those elves who resisted the call into the west, who never felt the influence of the Valar, who seem to have wanted little to do with the elves who returned out of the west. And then we've got the woodland realm of Thranduil, which is a mixed population of mostly Sylvan elves with a sort of an upper layer of aristocratic Sindar ruling over them. And then we've got the High Elves, which comprises territory from Lorien to Rivendell to Lindon. So a very diverse group overall, and the settlement model here reflects some of that diversity. One thing I like about the design of the Avari elves is that they're not sort of depicted as barbaric elves or savages living in the woods in furs and hides and so on. One of the key notes that we settled on early on in development of the Avari, and this is something that came out of Discord conversations, so thanks to all of you who were part of those, was that for the Avari we might look to Thrace for inspiration in terms of their aesthetic, in terms of their armaments, potentially clothing and armor and so on. And if you're curious to see how that looks in practice, you can take a look at our Avari preview video, which focuses on the battle side of things, the unit models and textures and so on. So the idea of the Avari building settlements and showing some apparent skill in doing so is not too unusual, perhaps. And of course, if you haven't noticed, you're looking at the Elven UI, the campaign UI here, again, which is going to be shared among all 3 of the Elven factions, and therefore has to do some kind of blending or straddling of the line between the more refined look of the High Elves and maybe the more flowing naturalistic designs of Woodland Elves and Avari. So a good balance struck there. Given their placement along the shores of the Sea of Rune, you can imagine that to the Avari, trade is likely to be somewhat important, and so you can see some of the port models here already set up for them. And again, the initial setup of campaign buildings and so on has not been settled, but you can imagine that it would be a good idea to quickly build up your naval trade, especially as such a small faction. And speaking of naval trade, this might be a good time to mention the navigable rivers that Eridan has designed. This is something that some viewers have pointed out actually in the comments, that you can tell on some of the rivers here on the mini-map that they look rather broad in places, but not all of them. So for example, part of the Anduin is bolded out, if you will, but not this area between, say, Osgiliath and the Falls of Rauros. South of that line, you've got a navigable Anduin, and indeed, from here all the way up towards what would later be Framsburg, you've got a navigable stretch of river. The Grey Flood also features a navigable area, but it does not look like the Grey Flood did in 4th Age, with a very, very broad river. And similarly, the Kelduin, although it looks just as wide as any other river, you'll find is actually navigable by ship all the way up towards the Long Lake. Now, this has some consequences. One, it does allow, of course, naval transport up the rivers, but perhaps even more consequentially, it allows for naval trade. And so that means securing provinces that are adjacent to some of these rivers that are navigable is going to be a little more important. And especially for a faction like the Avari, who's going to be surrounded potentially by hostile enemies not too long into the campaign, getting some trade going by conquering up the river is going to be possibly a good strategy. And another good strategy, as you would expect, is ambushes. The Avari have lots of wood in their territory, and as you can see, there's a bit more forest cover around the Sea of Rune than you may remember from the 4th Age Total War, in which a lot of this territory is imagined as mostly open, not really forested. So of course you've got the island here on the middle of the Sea of Rune, which is thickly forested. This area, which is canonically drawn as a forest by Tolkien, of course, is some of the thickest woods in the area, but there are some paths through it, so it's not just a blocked-off area that you cannot pass through. From here, from the settlement, you can go across this stream, which we've added, which comes down from some mountains, which we'll take a look at in another video, and you can actually pass out towards the east. But there's still enough forest cover down here to spring some tactical and strategic ambushes. There's also another province here that begins in rebel hands. This might make another good early grab for the Avari. It's well protected, we've got lots of forest and some hills in the territory, or at least in the vicinity. Alternatively, you may want to knock out some threats early on. I mean, the Avari could theoretically try declaring war on the big bully in the region, that being Great Rune, which is a faction we haven't looked at yet, but we will look at their campaign start in a future video. Although that would probably be a very tall order. If you get an army together, it might be kind of fun to see how much damage you can do in the southeast against the Wainriders. But I think the safer move overall is probably to move west and or north, or some combination of those two directions. You can establish yourself, get some trade going, build up a little bit, and try to weather the storm that is no doubt going to come. Again, we imagine the Avari to be a very difficult start, and we're not designing these factions to be equally difficult or equally balanced against one another. Some factions are just going to have an easier time. It just seems more reasonable. And the Avari, honestly, I don't mind if this is a faction that gets wiped out relatively early as an AI faction. The last thing you would want to see for lore friendliness would be a huge juggernaut elven faction emerging in the east. So we're going to do everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen. That means that this will be a rather fun one to try to survive as a player and grow as strong as you can to meet your victory objectives without being relegated to a footnote of history. Personally, my strategy, though, going to be to take out Thranduil. I'm going to wage an inter-elven war. This is my dream, so to speak, for this faction, because the idea of the Avari taking over another Mannish realm doesn't really appeal to me, but the idea of them taking over Sindarin realms, now that is something that I could get behind. The idea of a sort of latter-day kinslaying, if you will, going up the Kelduin, taking out Thranduil, cornering the market of the wine trade completely, and then maybe even going into Lorien, going into Rivendell, going all the way to Lindon in sort of a challenge mode campaign. But it's not simply for the perversity that I would want to do that. Taking over elven territories is one of the only ways you'll be able to train more elven units. It's not the only way, we do have a few tricks up our sleeve for that, but more details about those mechanics will have to await for another video. Until then, thank you for watching and take care.